And good afternoon. I'd like to start off by just turning to Scripture. If you'd turn with me to Genesis 1, verse 30. Genesis chapter 1, verse 30. We're here in the creation account. Genesis chapter 1, verse 30. It says, also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. So we're seeing here that God, in the creation account, has given to the birds of the air, to the beasts of the field, every green herb for food. It's an interesting thing to consider what animals eat, how much they eat. Did you know a milk cow has to consume about 23 million calories a day to produce the milk that they're eating? Because they're 1,000 pounds. They're a little bit bigger than we are. But in order to be able to produce all the milk that they're producing, a panda eating bamboo is going to consume around 1.1 million calories per day. Which I was like, that was astounding. I did a lot of math. I was like, okay, hold on. Did I do this wrong? A cat, a house cat, if you're looking at about a 10-pound cat, 300 calories a day. So these animals are eating various things. For those who like birds, parakeets, about 20 calories. 20 calories for a parakeet. If you go to the verse before this, actually in Genesis 1, verse 29, you see that what leads into this, God says to Adam, to mankind, he says, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed, to you it shall be for food. So grass, or the herb, is for the animals. For mankind, they not only get the herb that yields seed, but also the fruit from the trees. And there are some amazing fruits. I'm a big fan of mango. Love that. So God gives mankind the herbs of the field and the fruit of the trees. Now, depending on where you are on the face of this earth, you will consume various amounts of calories. The lowest count is 1,557 on average for those who live in Ethiopia. The highest, probably aren't surprised, right here in the United States, on average, 3,864 calories. So more than twice what is consumed in Ethiopia. On Thanksgiving here in the United States, Americans consume up to 4,500 calories. Now, to put that into perspective, calories is really about energy. And a calorie, if you were to take the calorie and do the conversion on Thanksgiving, the amount of calories that a human consumes, you could power a light bulb, or sorry, not a light bulb, but 5.2 watts, 5.2 watt hours. So you could, all those LEDs, the little 3 watt charger thing that you have, if you have an LED that consumes a low enough wattage, you can power it for an hour with the amount of calories that we would eat or consume, potentially, on Thanksgiving. Now, when we're talking about food and we're talking about what God has given us, I thought it would be fun here as we're getting maybe in the mindset of shopping and figuring out what you're going to prepare for Thanksgiving and all these other things that come up during this next week, to consider what do we eat to get those calories. Here in America, it's pretty, well, we're particular. We'll just say that. Americans like to eat attractive food. We like to eat pretty food. To the point that farmers will actually leave up to 40% of their crop in the field. They don't even bring it to the market because it's too ugly for us to buy. If the tomato isn't just the right way, unless maybe if you tack a label of heirloom or something like that on it, but artisanal, maybe we'll purchase it then. So they're trying to find different ways to get us to buy it and not leave it in the field. But up to 40% of a crop they'll leave in the field because it's not fit to be sold. It's estimated that actually in the supermarket, about 70% of all the meat in the supermarket is treated so that it appears fresher longer, because we don't want to buy something that doesn't look just a certain way. And if you look at any of the fruit that gets stacked up and all these different things, it's pretty amazing. That you're like, wow, that's just a beautiful piece of food. Well, that's because it's a special piece of food. It has been selected to be there, whatever it is, so that we can enjoy how it is looking. The CDC, though, with all of our desire for attractive-looking foods and good-looking foods, the CDC approximates that 60% of our diet actually comes not from the herb of the field or the tree, but from processed foods. So there are things that are processed to make it look attractive. So the CDC says about 60% of our diet, of those 3,864 calories, are coming from processed foods. Now, if you think, oh, well, that's bad, it gets worse, because the National Institute of Health actually found that about 40% of the calories consumed by individuals between ages 2 and 18 are actually coming from what are called empty calories. And empty calories are calories that come from food or drink that provide little to no nutritional value. A large culprit for that might be sodas. So you're talking about things that they're a fast-burning sort of thing, as opposed to perhaps what God has originally put in mind. But we're like, well, if it's attractive, if it looks good, if it tastes good, we'll eat that. Now, I'm not here talking about specific health food or whatnot. The reason I'm talking about this is because I think it would be interesting for us, as we're on the eve of one of the highest consumption days in America, that we consider not our physical caloric intake, but our spiritual caloric intake. And let's do that by turning over to Exodus 16. We see here what, in Genesis 1, what God gave mankind. He gave them specific food to eat. And we know that there are the food laws that are in place. We know that they were in place because you can go and read the distinction between them at the time of Noah. And there's something about man where if we're like, well, if it moves, if it looks tasty, if it looks attractive, I'm pretty sure I can eat that. There's a way I can cook that. Just ask Julia Child, open your French cookbook. You will find a way to make an attractive meal out of something. And so mankind likes to eat things, specific things, attractive things that are quite tasty. And for all that is said, as whether something is processed or not, you have these gorgeous meals. You're like, oh, that's beautiful. So much food science. Actually, the sidebar, Stanford University has one of the largest food sciences departments in the world, and they spend millions of dollars creating foods that we will enjoy. So they do taste tests. They have people try it out. They're like, oh, well, this is going to bring out this part of the taste bud. And then they can figure out, oh, and now you make it, and it's a frozen pizza. And we're like, whoa, I don't have to do any work. It tastes great. How do they do it? A lot of research. And they put all that time and effort into it. And so we will consume those. Now, in Exodus chapter 16, how are we going to get this over to spiritual calories? Let's talk about that. Exodus 16, verse 1. Here we have individuals whom God is working with. He was working directly with Adam, Eve in the garden, and mankind at the early part of it, and he said, here's what you get to eat. Now, when Israel is coming out of Egypt, they journey, in verse 1, from Elim. All the congregation of the children of Israel, they come to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. They remembered the good food. You know what? Road trips always sound great when you start off. But I tell you, if you're going on a long enough trip, there's only so much beef jerky and trail mix and fast food that you can eat before you're just like, am I craving a salad? Right? You're wondering about this. Like, you get to this point, you're like, I'd like to have an actual meal. Well, the children of Israel are like, we've been driving, we've been walking. They weren't driving, they were walking. They run out of that flatbread stuff. They run out of the things that they had, their provisions. They're like, you brought us out here to kill us. And they're remembering the food. Verse 4, and the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. This is an interesting combination of things that God does. He says, I'm going to physically provide something to also give a spiritual test. And it shall be, verse 5, on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. So God gives that test. Now let's jump down to verse 13. The quail are there in the evening, and they covered the camp. And in the morning, the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance, as fine as frost, on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat." They see something they've never seen before. Now, if you've ever gone, maybe traveling to go to the Feast of Tabernacles, or if you've done other world travel and you're like, that's a dish I have not seen. Generally, we might start off with a little bit of a side eye, and we'd be like, is it clean? Is this okay to eat? Or we might ask these other questions. Ask somebody who lives there, is this tasty? I don't know if I'm going to be adventurous enough to try it. But they're looking at this and going like, what is it? They had no idea what this new novel food was. And jump down to verse 21, get a little bit more description about this manna. They're saying this, what is it? This bread that God gave. So they gathered every morning, every man according to his need, and when the sun became hot, it melted. So it will melt under the heat of the sun, but it only appears after the dew, right? So after the dew evaporates and is gone, or the warmth of the sun takes the dew away, then this stuff appears, and it's small like frost. It's covering the ground, but if the sun gets too high in the day, it disappears, or it melts, and it's gone. And in verse 31, we get a little bit more about this. This is Exodus 16, verse 31. The house of Israel called its name manna, which means, translated, what is it? And it was like white coriander seed. And coriander seeds they're small and round, and it's a white coriander seed. And the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So you have this wonderfully new thing, and they're looking at it going like, I have no idea what this is. And they're told, in order to be able to get this, they actually have to collect somewhere around 3.7 quarts, so almost a gallon per person. If you get into exactly what it is, they're supposed to gather an omer, which is right around 3.7 quarts, or almost a gallon. So you imagine filling up a gallon with little round coriander seeds, having to collect that per person per day. And this is where the children of Israel were getting their caloric intake. Because when you're at least, we know that there were 600,000 men, besides women and children and the livestock. Once you start camping and you start spreading out, and you have animals and livestock, there's not many other places to have to go. And so I would imagine, this is Nathan's speculation here, you want to get up early because you got to go stake out your spot. Because if you're going to go outside of the camp, you know where dew is when it settles. Like, it doesn't go under the eaves, right? So you have to go farther out, and so you have to go and get your space because you know you've got a limited time window in which to go and gather this. So all these things are happening for the children of Israel, but it's not just about getting food, because God says, I'm going to give you something so that this other thing can occur. I'm going to give you this food. I'm going to provide for you because you're my children and I'm providing for you, but also this is a spiritual test. So I want to kind of dive into this, look at what is here for the manna that the children of Israel are having provided to them, and consider what it is that we do to get our spiritual calories. What is it that we do to get our spiritual calories? And the first thing that came to me as I was looking at this account of the manna is that their spiritual bread, now this might be a little bit of a stretch, I'll put that as a caveat first, their spiritual bread came after water. It's almost like a byproduct of the water. So the dew comes down, it's on the leaves. Let's go. This is verse 14 of Exodus 16, verse 14. It says, when the layer of dew lifted, so after the dew, and we know how dew doesn't just like lift, it's evaporating off, and what is left there is what is left there in verse 14, on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. So it's all over. If you know what frost looks like, well, frost is just frozen dew, right, all over the ground. So you have that condensation, but you have left there, the water is now gone, and what you have left is this bread. And so this spiritual bread that God is providing for them, or this physical bread that God is providing for them, is a byproduct seemingly of the water. Well, so too is our sustenance from God. Let's think about this chronologically on what the children of Israel have experienced to this point. They came out of Egypt, and what did God do? He provided them water from the rock, right? So we're stepping backwards here from the manna. They didn't have any water. They needed water from the rock. They get water from the rock. You step back a little bit earlier than that. What did he do? He brought them through the Red Sea. You step back a little bit earlier than that, and they're freed from slavery from via the Passover, right? The Passover lamb that was there. So now he's providing for them water in the plains via the dew, and then he's providing for them bread or meat. If you go through and you look up the word for bread here, it's primarily bread, but can also mean meat. It means food, grain, but he's providing for them sustenance as soon as that water burns off. Let's go to John chapter. Keep your spot here in Exodus 16. We'll be back quite a few times. But let's go over to John 4. We see this, I won't necessarily call it an order of operations, but there is something that has to happen first. So here in John 4, we'll read verses 6 through 15. John 4, verses 6 through 15. Jesus is here having a discussion with a woman, a Samaritan woman at the well. John chapter 4, verse 6. Now, Jacob's well is there. He had been on a journey, and he was weary from his journey, and it was about the 6th hour, and a woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." And the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." And the woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with." Now, living water, we kind of talked about this before when we were talking about the different types of water. Living water in vernacular for them meant like a stream. It was coming from a spring. If you're going into a well is not living water. A well is groundwater that bubbles up to fill the space so you can send down a bucket or a pail or something like that to draw it out from. It's not moving water. Living water by Jewish standards or standards of the time here would have been, again, we talked about this with mikvahs, springs, rivers, so it was flowing water. So she's saying, she's still not quite grasping what Jesus is saying, and she says, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?" And Jesus answered, verse 13, and said, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life." And the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw." A lot of people want that. A lot of people want the outcome of it. The children of Israel, they're there in the wilderness, and they're going, we have no food. We want food. So God gave them quail, and then God gave them the manna. Now, the conversation that after this, if you go through from John 4 on, you'll see actually, we understand, we know that Jesus' first miracle was turning the water to the wine. He does a lot of miracles with water. You go through here, the rest of John chapter 4 and 5, and we actually see going up through, we're going to next pick up in chapter 6, but you actually see these are miracles that are dealing with water. They're healings. They're washings. They're people being made whole. These are things that you clean things up. They're all miracles that I would say are around water. So again, for the children of Israel, they're out there in the wilderness. There's dew on the ground. The water is first, but then after the water comes something else. John chapter 6, verse 26. John chapter 6, verse 26. He's been having this discussion. He's already fed 5,000 people with bread. And the crowd follows him, desiring more. Another free meal, another bit of food. But Jesus has a conversation with him, because when they find him, he answered and said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you," this is John chapter 6, verse 26, "Most assuredly I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled." They experienced a miracle. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. And they said to him, what shall we do that we may work the works of God? And Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent. Therefore they said to him, what sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? And this has got to be a pretty audacious thing to say, given that they already know that he performed a miracle of feeding 5,000 people. And that's the whole reason they showed up. And he calls them out for showing up for just that reason. And then they go on in verse 31, they said, our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. The same exact request that the Samaritan woman at the well had for the living water. He says, this bread of life, it gives you life to the world. They're like, well, we want that. Verse 35, and Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. This spiritual bread, it's a byproduct of. It comes after, it follows the water. We have the water that comes first, and all these miracles of water. You have the dew on the ground, and after that you have the bread. Another attribute of this spiritual bread that they received, their sustenance, their caloric intake in the wilderness, is that the spiritual bread was unrecognizable at first. Right? I bet they knew what it looked like, a couple years in, a couple days in. They're like, oh, okay, this is the stuff we're gathering. But to start off with, it was unrecognizable. The spiritual bread was unrecognizable. The fact that they call it, this is back in, if you want to just jot down for this point, Exodus 16, verse 15. Exodus 16, verse 15. You don't have to turn back there because we're just going to turn back to John 6. But they look at it. They don't know it. They have never seen this before. And they look at it and they're like, what is it? And so it's called manna because they don't know what it is. But to them, it's a new food. It's not something like, there are times where I hear about these dishes that people have made. And they're like, oh, and so we did this. I'm like, who was the first person that thought that was going to be appetizing? Why would you make that? Like, somebody did, right? But they're looking at this and going like, what is that? Why? I've watched children, and it's been fun. Sometimes it's humorous, sometimes it's scary, but they will find things on the ground about the small size of a coriander seed, and they'll put it in their mouth. They just eat it, right? So little kids will experiment and find things. You're out there in the middle of the desert, you're like, oh, something's smelling around on the ground. Totally think I'm going to eat this. This is food. Well, if God hadn't made the miracle, right, you're looking at it, you're like, this is not food. This is not normally what I would eat. It's not the seed of the herb of the field. It's not the fruit of the tree. Why would this be something that I would naturally think this is what I should eat? So it is unrecognizable. I also, I think about the children of Israel, that we know that for them, bread, they're leaving Egypt, right? And God says, don't have time, pack up the kneading bowls, put them on your back, the bread is going to be flat. So we have that as we go through days of unleavened bread, right? But I remember bringing unleavened bread to school and trying to tell kids that it was bread was laughable. No, it's a cracker. It's not bread because it's not fluffy, it's not puffy, it's not a slice of bread, so therefore it's not bread. And again, it's unrecognizable. John chapter 6, verse 41, we'll read a good passage here because it's interesting. We see the same sort of reaction to this bread that Jesus was offering. John chapter 6, verse 41. The Jews complained about Jesus because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven. And they said, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then that he says, I have come down from heaven? So they're missing the point. They're arguing about, where's he from? We know him. He's not from heaven. Jesus therefore answered and said to them, do not murmur among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Therefore, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Now, not that anyone has seen the Father except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. Most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. Remember what he initially offered them? They said, well, what miracle are you going to do? Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. And he says, well, I am the bread of life. I come down from heaven. And they say, well, hold on. Now he's kind of flipping that on its head. He's like, oh, you want to talk about your fathers eating the bread, the manna that God provided them in the wilderness? They're dead. Right? It says, your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they're dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. The Jews therefore quarreled among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? And Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up in the last day. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever. And these are the things that he taught in the synagogue, as he taught in Capernaum. Therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a hard saying. Who can understand it? He jumped on to verse 66, and we see what the outcome was of this. And from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. The spiritual bread that was being offered, they're like, what is it? His flesh? Nope, I'm out. That's not bread. That's not what we eat. Now, Jesus is offering them, again, something different. It's a spiritual thing here. He's not offering them the physical, like there was manna. It was physical manna. Well, you eat the physical manna, you still die. But you eat of the spiritual bread that he is offering here in this discussion in John 6, and you have eternal life, the opportunity for eternal life. Again, spiritual bread is unrecognizable at first. Those in Judea didn't recognize it. Those who are in the wilderness didn't recognize it. A third attribute of this bread that is to be providing all of our caloric intake, all 3,864 calories we're eating in America. A third attribute of it is that the spiritual bread requires effort to acquire. Spiritual bread requires effort to acquire. Remember those empty calories? Oh, it's so easy to get them. My brother one time, my brother Peter made a salad. He lived with us in Arizona for a little bit, and he's like, I'll make a salad. So he was pitching in to help with the meal. Sorry, Peter, I'm calling you out. He made this salad. It had celery, it had carrots, it had radishes, it had a little bit of lettuce. It had some. I think it had some apples. It was the hardest salad that I have never worked as much to eat a salad as I did that one. It was kind of more like. It was just chunks of vegetables put together. Like normal salads are like leafy and they're fresh, but it's like you had to work hard to eat this salad. I remember at the end of it going like, oh, my jaw was. I was like, I don't think I ate whatever the main course was, the meat or whatever, because I was tired of working out, eating just this salad, right? Generally speaking, we like to go like, oh, how quickly can I get that good tasting thing or that easy thing, that convenient thing into me, right? Those processed foods, 60% of our diet is there. Well, God says spiritual food requires effort. Back in Exodus 16, let's turn there this time. Exodus 16, verse 16. Exodus 16, verse 16 says, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather according to each one's need. 1 omer for each person. Again, 3.7 quarts, almost a gallon. Let every man gather according to each one's need, 1 omer for each person, according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent. Verse 21 we see, and so they gathered it every morning, each man according to his need, And when the sun became hot, it melted. So every morning they have to go out and do this. It takes effort to get. And as I kind of talked about, I can just imagine people staking out their claim for the area that they were going to go ahead and gather. I'm guessing because God is fair, he didn't say like, well, I'm just going to rain down a big pile over here and less in this section. So it was all over like dew, like frost, right? It covers pretty equally through the area. But you have to go out and go collect it. And you have a limited window. So if you think about the sun comes up, this is a great time of year as we have the temperature drop. You look out and you'll be able to see frost on the ground. Note what time that frost goes away. And then note what time it might be uncomfortable for you to be sitting out there picking at little things in the ground because now the sun is beating on you. You're like, okay, so I might have from between... There are many difficulties in life, I guess. So for those of you listening on the webcast, that's my daughter. And so, difficulties collecting manna, difficulties with satisfied little kids, right? So anyway, trying to find my train of thought where we were again. The limited time window that you have to collect, right? If you're having the sun come up, the sunrise right now is hitting summer. It starts to creep over around 6 o'clock, but then it's high enough to start melting off the frost. You're around like 7 to 7:30, and then when it starts getting warm, right? You only have a couple hours to collect a gallon per person. Now, I remember picking blueberries. They're smaller than a cherry tomato, but I remember picking blueberries into gallon coffee cans when I was a kid. We went to this blueberry patch and you fill them and you have to go between the bushes, and that's standing. And I could fill one of those in probably... If it hadn't been picked over already, I could probably fill one of those gallon cans in about 10 to 15 minutes. But a blueberry, it's like about the size of my thumbnail. Coriander is only like 30 times smaller than that, right? So you're like just picking it. It's going to take work. It's going to take effort. They're going to have to do it. God gave them this time window to be able to be there. And so it's not just being out there to take the time, the diligence to get it. It's getting up on time. I've forgotten to take the trash out, or I've forgotten to do things. You're like, oh, I missed it. And so you got an extra week of having full cans in your garage. And you pay for not being there at the right time. So this effort that the Israelites are having to put in to get the manna is not just the actual physical picking up of the manna. It's being there on time. It's having a couple million people that you're having to contend with to be able to get space. It's all of those things that are required. The constraint on both sides of it to be able to get what they needed. Let's look at Luke chapter 9, verse 57. Luke 9, verse 57. We see here, just like the Israelites had to put in effort for the physical manna, there's an expectation that we put forth effort to acquire the spiritual bread that God gives. Luke chapter 9, where am I? Verse 57. Luke 9. That's not right. Which one did I want for that? Well, let's go to Luke 19. We'll do Luke 19, verse 11. We'll try that one. I wrote the wrong one for that. Luke 19, verse 11. This is the parable of the minas. It says, now as they heard these things, Jesus spoke another parable because he was near Jerusalem and because they thought the kingdom of God would appear immediately. And he says to them, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return. So he called 10 of his servants, delivered to them 10 minas, and said to them, do business until I come. He gives the gift. He gives them, I think I had mentioned, maybe it was the last time I spoke, this is about 3 months worth of income. He says, I'm going to go. I want you to do business while I'm gone. And so there's effort that it requires. For those who don't do anything with what he's given, he says, oh, you're unprofitable. You read further on in this parable, he says, I knew you to be an austere man. You're reaping where you don't sow. This is kind of what you do. And he's like, well, you knew that. It takes effort on our part to acquire it. We also know that for those who want to be a disciple, it takes a lot. He says, well, foxes have their den, other animals have the place where they are. There's no place for the Son of Man to rest. If you're going to put your hand to the plow and look back, you're not fit for the kingdom. If you think, oh, you know what I need to do in order to be able to follow you, first I have to go say goodbye to these people, I have to bury this person. He's like, no, there's a cost. It's going to require something of each and every one of us. We can't attain to or acquire that the spiritual bread that he's offering without us putting forth effort. And this is a big difference, because a lot of times people will confuse the effort that God expects from us with earning our salvation. And those are two very different things, right? I want to make that very clear, because God expects us to do things. If you love me, keep my commandments. Guess what? That's doing something, right? That doesn't make us worthy. That doesn't earn us what he's offering. Nothing is going to be like, wow, you are the person who has earned the opportunity to become a part of my family as a God being. No, none of us are going to earn that, but he does expect us to do something. Get up, be up early enough before the sun burns off, so you can get into the position, burns off the frost, so you can get into the position, so you can pick these tiny little coriander seeds worth of manna, a gallon per person. And you think today that's if you're in America, you only have like 1.2 children, as opposed to if you're in another area where you got multiple children. You can go read through the genealogies and chronicles, and you can see they do not have 1.2 children. So you're gathering a lot of little tiny coriander seeds per household, per tent, as it was. So it takes effort to acquire the spiritual bread that God is providing. A fourth attribute of this spiritual bread, which is an interesting thing, is that the spiritual bread that God offers has a custom caloric profile. A custom caloric profile, meaning it works no matter who's taking it in, which I found interesting. Go back to Exodus chapter 16 and we'll see this, which I found wonderfully intriguing. I think this would be the best thing ever for us today, because there are families who have growing boys, and to only collect the same amount of food would be amazing as they get bigger and they eat what they're eating. But Exodus chapter 16, verse 17, it says the children of Israel did so, and they gathered some more, some less, because it was based on what God told them. This is Exodus 16, verse 17. Verse 18 says, so when they measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's need. He told them 1 omer per person. So are you saying like a half omer for a kid, or like what if they're under 12? Is it free? Like, how does this work with getting the correct amount? Well, God says you get 1 omer per person who's in the tent. And they did that, and they had enough. They didn't have lack. They didn't have too much. That's pretty amazing. Again, I would like to be on this food plan, because then it doesn't matter, because I think our son is already eating more than my wife does at most meals, and he's 10. So, it's only going to go up from there. And we see this happening. But God has provided a custom caloric profile for those he's providing this bread, not only with the manna, but also for us. Let's go to John 15, verse 2, and we'll see this. John 15, verse 2. He does the same for us regarding the spiritual bread that he provides. John chapter 15, verse 2. His desire in all things is to be able to have growth, right? We want our kids to grow. The reason we're eating food is to be able to grow, to keep moving, to burn off the light bulb worth of energy that we're producing, right? But John chapter 15, verse 2, Jesus says, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes it away. So he's going to clip it off. But even those that do bear fruit, the branch that bears fruit, he prunes it that it may bear more fruit. Now, if you've done any kind of gardening or fruit tree work or anything like that, you know that you'll find out there are some plants that you're going to do extra work for. This one keeps flopping over because it got the wind blew it over, or whatever happened. You're going to pin it up. You're going to do extra pruning on this part of the tree versus that part of the tree because it needs something different. Okay? So, when we're pruning, that's exactly the same sort of thing that God is doing. He's saying, he's looking at the plant, he's saying, okay, this is not producing something, this is. This is producing, and it's doing great. How can I make that produce more. Romans chapter 12, verse 3 through 8 brings us out again. Romans 12, verses 3 to 8. Romans 12, beginning in verse 3. It says, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. For as we have many members in one body, but all the members do not have the same function. We're unique, we're different. So we, being many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another, having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us." You have the parable of the minas, you also have the parable of the talents, where he gives the minas to all 10 of his servants, 1 mina to each. In the parable of the talents, he gives, to one, he gives more talents than to the other. And here we have a differing type of talent. He gives them differing gifts according to the grace that is given to us. Let us use those gifts. If prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Or ministry, let us use it in our ministering. He who teaches in teaching, he who exhorts in exhortation, and he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. There's an expectation in this uniqueness of what God has provided for us. He says, here, this is for you. And when we see someone functioning within their gifts, it's a beautiful thing. It's inspiring to be able to see. God says, here, I'm going to give you a bit of the Spirit, but it's going to be unique to you. And it's going to manifest itself in a unique way, just to be what we need. So we have spiritual bread that has a custom caloric profile. The fifth attribute that we'll talk about today is that the spiritual bread cannot be hoarded. It's not like toilet paper in the middle of COVID. It's not like all these other things that people want to hold on to for some reason or the other, but the spiritual bread cannot be hoarded. This was quite the odoriferous lesson for the children of Israel when they're out there at the beginning. I'm guessing that it didn't take long for them to be like, yep, don't do that. I'm guessing it probably took once. Maybe there was somebody who was a little bit more belligerent and took a couple times, but I don't think so with the description that we have here. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 19, Moses said, "Let no one leave any of it till morning." Now we know that if they collected the amount that God told them to collect, there was no excess and there was no lack. It's amazing. You have your omer, you have your omer. It says, don't let any of it stick around till morning. Notwithstanding, even though they were warned, they did not heed Moses. But some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. Now we have a compost bin that we take out for our chickens. It's right behind our sink. It takes more than a night to breed worms and stink, which I'm very thankful for. But this is something special, because overnight it breeds worms and it stank, and Moses was angry with them. So this is not something you'd be like, well, I'm going to get all the bread. You think about this going back to the water, going back to the offering that Christ had to the Samaritan woman. To be able to take a drink and not have to do more of a drink, that's a beautiful thing. Because you're like, okay, it's not like, well, I'm going to be continually drinking from this and I alone control the source, like the fountain of life. Or this is the bread. You can eat this bread and you're going to have eternal life. That'd be amazing to be able to eat. But it's like, no, I'm going to have all of the bread so no one else can get it. That's not how God functions. That's not what he's offering. You cannot hoard it. Let's go to Luke chapter 12. Luke 12, verse 16. Luke chapter 12, verse 16. Jesus is speaking a parable to them. It says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for yourself for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. See, it's not the issue with being rich. The issue here was the person wanted to keep it all for himself. If you have a lot, God expects a lot. If you have, he expects us to pass along to others. It's freely you have received, freely also give. That's something he told his disciples as he sends them out. That's Matthew 10 verse 8. He says, freely you have received, freely also give. To think that we can sit there and be the arbiter and the one who hoards what God has given, and there are so many other scriptures we could likely turn to. When we recognize that he is the master and we are the servant, it's like a servant slowly ferreting away a bit of his master's wealth for himself. You're like, that doesn't check. He's providing you the food. You think you're going to get rich off of your master. It just doesn't work that way. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, we'll see here another example here. This idea that the spiritual bread that God is providing, it cannot be hoarded. And the outcome of that hoarding is, it just spoils. It doesn't stay good. If we're thinking that we're going to be able to keep it all and make sure that we're set and maybe nobody else is, or take so much more that maybe we can sell it off or something like that, it spoils. It goes bad. We have to have it coming in on a daily basis. We had a whole other series of messages you could make about that, about having to go out and collect it each day. Give us this day our daily bread. That spiritual bread has to be a daily thing. But in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 is where we'll pick it up. We're told, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And again, when you think about the parallel here with the Israelites, if you're wanting to go ahead and hoard all of this, it's like, what does that say about your heart? If you're not listening to what God has said, he says, I told you, use it, tomorrow I'll provide some more. So there's this opportunity to grow in faith, knowing that he's going to provide for us. Because if you were to go through life and you didn't have a refrigerator, and you just had what was right there in front of you, right? And that was the day, you might live a little bit differently. We might not be eating 3,800 calories a day. We might be a different kind of people because we're relying on God on a daily basis. Well, what is today going to bring? It's a very different kind of existence. And because we're so wealthy and with largesse in this country, we have what we need. We have almost 3 times what the country that consumes the fewest calories in this world has. We have almost 3 times that. And so we are wealthy. We can store up for years, and let us take our ease. We can go into that mindset because we have the physical bounty. But it's so important for us to remember, physical bounty is not the same as spiritual bounty. Physical sustenance is not the same as spiritual sustenance. So many people will try to equate the two. And that's not how it works. That's the health and wealth gospel. That's not how it works. God says here, I want you to pursue it every day. Put in the effort. Put in the work. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort on our part. But what he provides for us, again, what he provides for us, it goes right in line. We're only talking about the bread portion of things, but it goes right in line with the water or the spirit that he provides. It's something we have to learn to recognize. It's something we have to put in the effort, and it's something that when we take it in, it's custom for each of us, whatever it is that we need. And because it's custom for each of us, it's not something that we can hoard and think that, well, this is just for me. Because God expects us to use it and then to take that wonderful talent, that gift that he's given to each of us, and manifest that out, to build the body, to take others in as well, and to provide for them. This Thanksgiving, as we look at what's on the table, I hope that we also take some time to consider the spiritual bounty that God gives us. Consider the caloric intake that he's providing. Don't have those empty calories, spiritually speaking. Put in the effort, put in the time, and let's make sure that we give thanks to him for all that he has done.